The game of basketball, a sport that has changed and evolved over the course of its inception since the day it was played with beach baskets, from not the most athletic but talented ball handlers to the game being centered around big men, to inefficient, low-scoring offenses, to a physical style of basketball, to what we now know of it today as an insanely talented pool of players with heavy offense, high-scoring games, and heavy volume three-point shooting. How much three-point shooting, you might ask? Well, in the 2001-2002 season, the Boston Celtics led the league in threes attempted, and by a wide margin at that, at 23.7 attempts per game, followed by the Orlando Magic in second at 20.2 attempts per game. This season, the Chicago Bulls have the fewest attempted threes in the entire NBA at 28.7 threes a game. The Golden State Warriors lead the league in threes at over 43 a game, almost double the amount of threes the Celtics took in the 2001-2002 season. Safe to say, the game has changed drastically, as have the skills of players throughout the years, but there are some players who, while increasingly skilled, simply put, played in the wrong era of the NBA. Players who could have legitimately been superstars had they just been born in a different time period where their strengths would have flourished. And in this video, I'm going to be talking about 5 players in particular that would have fit that mold. If you're new to the channel and you enjoy this type of content, feel free to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss a video. Also, leave some feedback in the comments, as it always helps improve the channel as well as the type of content you guys would like to see. Now, I'm going to be covering 5 players who would have benefited playing in another era of the NBA, and yes, I'm aware there are a lot of other players in the history of the NBA who have done better or would have done better in certain eras, while others might not have succeeded had they not played in their respective time periods in the NBA. These are just 5 players that I thought were worth highlighting, but you let me know some of the others in the comments who fit this mold as well. And the player that I want to start with is Ben Simmons. Now, of course, it's fun to clown Ben Simmons and his complete inability to shoot a basketball from pretty much anywhere beyond 10 feet. And of course, he hasn't at all lived up to the hype of being one of the greatest NBA prospects since LeBron James. And obviously, his game has fallen off a cliff this season after being traded to the Brooklyn Nets, and his confidence obviously has been completely shot. But Ben Simmons, at his peak, even in an era that is heavily predicated on shooting, was one of the best defenders and playmakers in the league. People forget that he was a 2-time first-team All-Defensive Team player and a 3rd-team All-NBA player. And it's not every day you see a 6'10 guy who can run the point, facilitate an offense, get downhill to the basket with a quick first step, and still defend the perimeter at an elite level. What really caused Ben Simmons and his downfall was his inability and sometimes unwillingness to work on and improve his shot in an era of the NBA where you must be able to shoot, or at least not be afraid to shoot, to even be considered an above average NBA player. Shooting is basically a requirement at this point to be an effective player in the NBA in 2023. But that wasn't always the case. You see, while yes, shooting was still important back in the day, you kind of needed to be able to score in the game of basketball, but the reliance on shooting as part of a team's offense wasn't as pivotal, say, 20 or 30 years ago versus what it is today. And for a guy like Ben Simmons, an athletic big, who can run the point, play elite defense, but also give you solid offense by way of facilitating as well as scoring at the rim, would have been something teams would have been all over and trying to get on their squad. I know it seems crazy to say now, but Ben Simmons, playing in the 80s or 90s, would have been a dominant force, and I can honestly see him being a top 10 player in the league, not based on what we know of Ben Simmons right now because his confidence is completely shot and his overall performance has dropped dramatically, but if we're talking about the healthy Ben Simmons from just a couple of seasons ago, who made an All-NBA team and was a first-team All-Defensive player, that Ben Simmons would have been such a great player in an era where there wasn't as much focus on shooting. I mean, you look at guys like Magic Johnson, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, who most would consider them to be top 5 players of all time, but they most certainly were not shooters, and yet they still dominated in their respective era in the NBA. Not putting Ben Simmons on the same level as Kareem and Magic, because that would just be straight disrespectful to those two legends, just using them as an example for why Ben Simmons and his lack of shooting wouldn't have mattered as much had he played during that time period. The next guy on this list, DeMar DeRozan. Now, don't get me wrong, DeMar DeRozan, despite maybe not having the ideal skill set for today's NBA, is still balling and has really done so throughout his career. 6-time All-Star, 3-time All-NBA player, has put in over 20,000 points throughout his career, and doing so not putting up as many threes as you see players doing across the league. He's still an elite scorer, one of the better players in the NBA. That being said though, Could you imagine DeMar DeRozan playing basketball in the 90s? We call him the mid-range assassin. 90s basketball was all about mid-range shooting. Players were rarely taking threes at that time and focusing on higher percentage shots in the paint or mid-range shooting, which is now obviously seen as a low percentage shot in today's game. But at that time, because of guys like Michael Jordan, Larry Bird, Karl Malone, Clyde Drexler, Patrick Ewing, guys who were some of the best players of that decade, mainly operating in the paint or shooting mid-range jumpers, it wasn't seen as a bad shot then because these guys had really perfected the art of the mid-range, and players also just weren't great at shooting threes back then. It's why they didn't take very many of them, because players couldn't consistently shoot the three ball at over 40% clip, even on low volume. And so for DeMar DeRozan, a guy who led the league last year in 2-point field goals made, by far and away the leader in the NBA for the last 3 seasons with the most mid-range shots, and can hit said mid-range shots at near 50%, damn near prime Michael Jordan level numbers, it's safe to say that DeMar DeRozan would have been a nasty player playing in the 90s and would have been a bona fide superstar in the league. DeRozan is still a star in the NBA currently, but I don't think anyone would classify him as a superstar or a top 10 player in the NBA. The next guy I wanted to talk about is actually a player who played decades ago and was still a great player during his time in the NBA, but likely would have fared much better playing in today's NBA, and that's Toni Kukoc. Now, I really don't like it when people say Toni Kukoc would have basically been Luka Doncic had he played in today's NBA, which I've only heard a few people say that, and I think those were just really extreme hot takes. Like, no, Luka is leaps and bounds a better player than Toni Kukoc, even if you put Toni in the NBA in 2023. But I do think Kukoc would have fared much better in today's NBA than he did in the 90s. You see, what was great about Kukoc that was maybe not appreciated as much in the 90s was his ability to shoot it from outside at an efficient rate. And had he been given the green light to put up more threes, regardless of missing a handful of them as players are instructed to do today, and you combine it with Kukoc's passing and playmaking, who could even act as a point forward or playing off the ball as a floor spacing wing, would have been incredible in today's NBA. People forget that in the Bulls' 72-10 year in 96, Kukoc was shooting 40% from downtown in near 3 attempts per game, which was a lot for that time period, and actually shot 44% on 2.5 attempts per game after he was traded away from the Bulls. Again, might have panned out differently had he put up threes at a much higher volume. He may not have been able to knock them down at an efficient rate, and there were years where Kukoc actually shot the three ball below 30%, but I feel like in an era that is designed around floor spacing wings, bigs that can shoot, they can play both on and off the ball and facilitate on offense are so highly coveted, whereas Kukoc, during his years in time with the Bulls, he was just a very good role player. The next player on this list is actually another guy who was a solid player back in the day, but likely would have benefited from today's style of offense in the NBA, and that's a guy by the name of Michael Adams. Now, most people probably haven't heard of Michael Adams. I'll admit, I remember watching basketball as a kid in the 90s as the guy who took a lot of threes. That's how I knew him, as if it was a bad thing because you lived and died by the three, because that's how the game was viewed at the time. And what's funny is that Michael Adams actually had a pretty short career in the NBA with a slow start and then a quick decline with a very narrow prime window. But it's funny because Michael Adams was actually really ahead of his time, ahead of the analytics game around the three-point shot, because while coaches were reluctant to have their players just put up a ton of threes unless, you were wide open, Michael Adams just didn't care. He let threes fly all day, even if he was missing the majority of them. For 4 straight seasons in the late 80s and early 90s, Michael Adams put up the most threes in the NBA, and it wasn't even close to those that came in second or third. And while Adams didn't necessarily shoot them on the best efficiency, he still hit them often enough to be impactful on offense and actually finished with the most threes made in the league in back-to-back seasons. Get this, in the 1990-91 season, Michael Adams averaged 8.5 threes per game on only 29.6% shooting. The man attempted 8.5 threes in the NBA in 1990 and didn't even shoot it that well. But guess what? That season, he averaged 26.5 points per game, which was 6th in the league. 2 seasons before that, he put up 6.1 threes per game on 35% shooting in 1988. The other reason I believe Michael Adams would have been more successful in today's NBA, aside from his overconfidence shooting it from deep, is the fact that, like a lot of point guards today who are very ball-dominant, high-volume scorers, Adams was actually a very gifted passer and floor general. The season that he put up 26.5 points per game on that high volume from 3, he also averaged 10.5 assists per game. He also wasn't a bad rebounder as well, despite only being 5'10". Might seem like a bit of a stretch, but I could see Michael Adams having a similar role as someone like Trae Young in the modern NBA. Maybe not the most efficient three-point shooter, but can score in a hurry, a very effective passer, and plays with a ton of confidence despite most people counting them out because of their size. And then finally, the last player who would have benefited by playing in a different era than today's NBA, Andre Drummond. Andre Drummond has had a very odd career in the league, and the fact that he quickly rose the ranks and being viewed as one of the young up-and-coming talents in the NBA with his ability to crash the boards but also possess great footwork in the paint to get easy buckets at the rim. His sheer size and physicality made him a force for any center to go up against, and in his early 20s, he was already leading the league in rebounding, was an all-star, an all-NBA player, a double-double machine, and then the league quickly started taking shape and being focused more on outside shooting, floor spacing, and Drummond was getting labeled as a traditional big man who doesn't fit in the modern NBA, and at that point, he started getting tossed around from team to team. And while he's still an incredible rebounder, one of the best rebounders in the league when you look at his numbers on a per 36 basis, or especially his rebounding percentage rate, but even with that, yeah, I mean, he is a liability in a lot of regards because he clogs the paint, doesn't have a jump shot whatsoever, and he also just makes a lot of boneheaded plays. Trust me, I know as a Bulls fan. But Andre Drummond, in the 80s or 90s, playing a traditional big man role, hustling for boards, posting up against other bigs, using his body to grab offensive rebounds and put back dunks, not having to worry about trying to help space the floor, being able to block more shots at the rim because guys weren't taking so many threes back then. Andre Drummond, with his skill set and ability to rebound, post up, block shots, but also score at a decent rate, at least in his prime anyway, would have been one of the better players in the NBA, if not a true superstar in the league in the 80s or 90s. Now, you could go back even further to the days of Wilt Chamberlain and Bill Russell and say that had Drummond played in that era, he would have rivaled those two as all-time greats, but really you could say that about a lot of big men of today if you place them in the 50s or 60s, simply because the level of competition and what it is today is unprecedented compared to the level of talent guys had back then going up against Wilt Chamberlain and Bill Russell. I'm sure as time goes on, as the game of basketball evolves even further, we'll see more and more player comparisons and what they would have been able to do had they been placed in another era. But aside from these 5 players, I want to know what you guys think. Which players do you think would have benefited playing in a different time in the NBA? Let me know in the comments. Be sure to subscribe, and I will see you guys in the next one.